So have you ever sent something through a copy machine and somebody's left the colored paper in, right? But I got it done and I thought, it's not too dark. Maybe I won't kill any more trees. I'll just use the orange. So, so today we're talking about the tombs of Jesus, and that is not it's not a typo. The tombs of Jesus is meant to be plural. So it's interesting though, because the idea with this, I was talking to a friend of mine today, and I said, it was earlier this week, and I said, I'm talking about the tombs of Jesus, and he said, really? I said, yeah. He's like, what are you going to say? There's nothing in them? and it is kind of funny, because, if we found some tomb that said these are the bones of Jesus Christ who started a religion, a sect in Judaism, and went on, and that would be a problem, right? That would be a serious problem for us. But luckily, that's not our problem. As a matter of fact, it is an interesting thing that for a long time we didn't have any real evidence of people being crucified. As far as in bones, like bodies. And so, there's lots and lots of tombs in this area. And so you would expect, if crucifixion was as big of a deal as it's made out to be, that you'd see more of it. And so the interesting thing, for a long time, there was this sense that maybe it was because it was a criminal, right? And so it was a criminal punishment, and so in the Jewish culture, if you were convicted of a crime, you didn't get to be buried with your family, right? It was, you were kind of cut off, even in death. But then there's this really interesting passage in, there's this first century historian named Josephus, and he's talking about the practice of crucifixion, and how most people just cast away the bodies of the crucified. And then he says, but the Jews used to take so much care of the burial of men. They took down those that were condemned and crucified and buried them before the going down of the sun. And so you've got Josephus who says, wait, yes, it was criminal, it was a shameful death, but they were buried, right? So before it was, they aren't buried, but then we hear Josephus say, but the Jews, they really buried them. And actually, when you look a little bit further into it, turns out the Jews said, well, if they were convicted of a crime, against the Jewish law, it's fine, but really, the Romans don't count, right? We don't really like those guys anyway. And so the Romans don't count, so they would take these people off and then they would bury them. And so the question really was, why is it that we didn't find them? Well, eventually, we found one guy, right? A guy who had been crucified and was buried in a tomb. His name is Yohanan. And Yohanan, this is him right there. Now the reason that we have this is an ankle bone, is because as they were crucifying Yohanan, it looks like the nail hit like a knot in the wood and was bent, and it wasn't able to be removed. And so when he was buried, the nail is still there. So this is a crucifixion, like a bone, an ankle bone of someone who was crucified from the time of Jesus. Not Jesus, but still pretty cool. And the interesting thing is that as people have kind of tried to figure out why it is that we don't have more crucified bones, one of the reasons is that, like we said, there's lots of tombs, and they're in, it's like having really ancient tombs in downtown Mobile, right? And every time the RSA decides to buy another plot of land and build another tower, they start digging and they find more tombs. As a matter of fact, any guy who wants to put in an irrigation system in his backyard might find a tomb. And so it turns out there's so many tombs, and they're so common that people, whenever they find them, it's very common to just say, okay, what's in here? We're going to take all this stuff. And if you find something like that, you're definitely putting that on eBay. You know what I'm saying? You're definitely going with the black market on that, and you're going to make some money from this, this bone from Israel that's got a nail through it, that kind of thing. And so, as a matter of fact, there's only been one tomb of all of these tombs that has been discovered and excavated by archaeologists before it was disturbed. Only one undisturbed tomb has ever, and there's hundreds and hundreds of these tombs. Only one has ever been unearthed totally undisturbed by archaeologists. And then the other thing is the tombs that you find most of the time, the tombs that we're thinking of, right, the ones that are cut into the rock, that's the rich people's tombs. And rich people weren't often crucified, right? If you were rich, instead of being crucified, you might just, pay off the guard, right? And so you don't find a lot of rich people that were crucified, period. And so most of the tombs that you find are wealthy people. The people who were not wealthy, they had trench-style burial, and so they would dig a long trench, and then they would cut down at an angle. And they would put the body in there, and then they would fill it with, all the different things that they're doing, and then they would fill it with dirt, and it would be fine. So every once in a while, they find a body like that, but most of the time, those bodies are decomposed and they're gone. It's not the same kind of thing. So it's very rare to find a non-wealthy person's body, a non-wealthy person's remains. Now, like I said, there's two tombs that we're talking about. The first one, it's first because I like the name better. Because it's called the Garden Tomb. And there it is. That's it. The Garden Tomb. That's the door. That's pretty cool. It's nice. Got a nice little bushes out there. Anyway, so if you go to Israel, you're going to go to the Garden Tomb and you're going to look at it. Now, the story of this tomb is interesting. It was discovered in 1867 by a peasant. The peasant was starting to dig a cistern, and he found this tomb. This is a story that you hear all the time, right? So he's digging the cistern, he finds this tomb, and then this guy who was a European who was kind of sending back reports from the Holy Land, named Conrad Schnick. In 1874, he hears about this, he goes to the tomb, and he checks it out, he's like, oh wow, this is a garden tomb. And so maybe this is the tomb of Jesus. So he sends word back, and everybody's really excited, and then he goes back to check it out, and in between when he first inspected it, and sending the word back, and then coming back to check it out again, the guy cleared everything out of it, right? Because he wasn't wanting to use it. And so pretty much all the contents right there in that front area were cleared out at that point. The next we hear about the Garden Tomb, it's this general named General Charles George Gordon. Now, he's a pretty famous general. And he was one of these guys that at the time he was kind of very famous, and he was also very religious. And so he decided that he was going to go to the Holy Land and spend some time really pondering the things of faith and spending time with God. And so he goes to the Holy Land, and he sits here, and he's staring at this tomb, and he says, this is it. I mean, this is the tomb, right? And so he says, this isn't just the tomb, but he says that it's Golgotha, right? And he says it's Golgotha because if you're sitting there staring at the tomb at the right time of day and the sun hits the rock just right, it looks like a skull, which Golgotha is the place of the skull, right? So you can kind of see that right there on the side of the hill, right? And so he said, as a matter of fact, if you look at a map of the holy city of Jerusalem, you make the pelvis bone the temple, and then right where the head should be, right where the skull should be, would be this place, this Golgotha. And then where the feet should be, it was, I can't remember, something else, some important entryway into the city. And he said, look, this is it. It has to be it. That's where the skull would be. Now, he was a general, right? he was used to saying things very definitively and very convincingly, but he was not an archaeologist. And though when the sun hits it, I mean, I can see it. It kind of reminds me of Castle Grayskull. It's really not, well, I don't know, he's just a general. So let's keep going. So all the way up really until 1975, all of the reports about this tomb were done by people like the general or like that guy who happened to live in Jerusalem was writing back to everybody, and not really scientific stuff going on. But in 1975, a group of archaeologists went in and they said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to kind of sweep the area. We're going to look into all the nooks and crannies and figure out exactly what's going on with this tomb. And they found three figurines. And when they looked at the figurines, they were consistent with, two of them were from the Iron Age, and one was from the Middle Age. The Iron Age, if you remember, is 700 to 600 BCE. So you've got two from the Iron Age and one from the Middle Ages. And so you've got basically several hundred years before Jesus, several hundred years after Jesus, but nothing in there that's kind of at the time of Jesus. As a matter, and then the more that they looked at it, they said, okay, now the way in Jesus' time the tombs are laid out like this, you'll have one room here and another room there. But in this one, it's one room here and a room over here. So that was more of the Iron Age design. Now, what's interesting about this, though, is that it's in this complex of tombs. And so there's a whole lot of tombs in this area. And you really look at this, and some of these tombs are Christian tombs, and some of these tombs are very, very ancient, very old tombs. And you really, well, that's like just a couple of meters from this tomb to this is the one that we're looking at right here, the garden tomb. Just very, very close. And you really want this to be it, right? Because there's the garden, right? This is the place it's got to be. And when you look at it just right, and the sun shines, it looks like a skull, right? You can understand this, the real passion that it takes. But the problem is, in this area, there's not a whole lot of tombs around the time of Jesus. As a matter of fact, there's none in this whole complex that are from the time of Jesus. Most of them are, you probably guessed it, from the Iron Ages and then much later. So then they finally found some pottery. And remember, we talked about on the very first day, that's one of the main ways that they date things in these archaeological excavations. They've got a very, very clear dating method using the methods of the pottery, the materials, the way that it was cast, the whole deal. And so they found several pieces of pottery, little oil lamps is what this is. And they can really definitively date this place. And they say this tomb is actually an Iron Age tomb. And in the Middle Ages, it was probably reopened and used again. So, there we have it. Lots of Iron Age evidence, and though there's nothing in there that says, I cut this out in the Iron Age, all of the stuff points to that. And so, though when you go to the Holy Land, if you ever do, I haven't, but if you do, you're going to go to the Garden Tomb, right? You're going to see this, and they're going to sell it, right? They're really going to sell it. And when you look at it, I mean, it just looks like the tomb. You know what I'm saying? It's got the like earthy look, and there's a little garden outside, but it's just what you imagine his tomb to be like. But there's no real archaeological proof for that. The other tomb is the least likely, in my opinion. When you just look at it, it doesn't make sense. This is what it looks like. It's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's the traditional place for Jesus' tomb. And it looks like that. And when you look at it, you say, wow, that kind of looks like, I don't know, a Catholic church or something. And it kind of is. It's a Catholic and Orthodox and Armenian church. But when I look at that, that's not what's in my head, right? when I think of them going in with Jesus' body and laying him in, there's not a lot of vestments. There's not a lot of portraits of Jesus on a cross. Definitely no gold in there in my head, right? And so when I look at this, when I first looked at this, I was like, come on, really, guys? This is, I don't know, right? But it's interesting. This has a really interesting history, this location. Before the time of Jesus, it was a quarry. Before the time of Jesus, it was a quarry. And somewhere, not too far removed from Jesus' life, they stopped using it as a quarry, and they filled it with dirt. And it became a garden. It became a garden, and it had everything that you would think of, lots of plants and olive trees and all that kind of stuff in the garden. And then Jesus came and lived and died, and sometime after he died, sometime pretty soon after he died, people started to venerate this as the location of Jesus' tomb. And when they did that, it kind of became that traditional site. Then, a Roman emperor named Hadrian, who was not a big fan of Christians, he was very much not a big fan of Christians. He came in and he said, we're not going to do this whole Christian thing. And so he poured in a bunch of dirt and leveled the area and built a pagan temple on top of the site. And so it was a temple to Aphrodite, and it was exactly what you think. It's columns and the whole 9 yards. And so that happens, and the Roman Empire kind of continues. And then there's a really big moment in history, and a really big moment in Christianity, where Emperor Constantine, right, the Roman emperor, has this vision. And he's on the battlefield, he has this vision of a cross, and Jesus speaks to him, and they win the battle, and he converts to Christianity. And when he converts to Christianity, all of Rome converts to Christianity. And so he sends his wife to the Holy Land to kind of check out some of these sites where they need to maybe build some temples and things. And so she goes there. When she goes there, Helen, she says, where was the site of Jesus' tomb? Now, one of the things that if you ever go to Jerusalem, if you visit this site, you're gonna go through the city. It's really in the middle of the city. And it was already in the middle of the city by the time that Helen was there. As a matter of fact, the story of her going there is they get her into the middle of the city, and she's like, this is not outside the city. Like, this isn't this can't be it. And they said, no, really, this is it. And it lends a little bit of credibility to it, because even though there was a pagan tomb built on there, on top of it, they continued to venerate the site as the place of Jesus' tomb. And so after she goes and she inspects it, she says, wow, it really is. And so Constantine builds the first Christian temple here, and that's the layout of it. And that's largely the layout of the current temple. Now, in this temple, when you go there, it said that it houses Golgotha, the rock upon which the crucifixion happened, as well as the tomb. And so you kind of walk to this other area in the building, and you see this. This is Golgotha. This is the rock. And so there's a crack in the rock, and it said that crack happened at the moment that that the earthquake happened that happened right after Jesus died. And the Golgotha was part of the stuff that was being venerated well before any of this happened. Now, I mentioned the fact that this was an odd location. So let me walk you through. This is kind of what you think of as Jerusalem. The city now sprawls out really large, but that's the temple is right here, that white part. And early on, this was Jerusalem. And then during Jesus' time, Jerusalem extended through this green area. So it was the blue area and the green area in Jesus' time. So though right now the church is right here, though right now the church is in the middle of everything, and you're going to have to crawl over people and cars and smog and all that kind of stuff to see it. At the moment, at the time when Jesus was crucified, it was just outside the city. As a matter of, so in John chapter 19, verse 20, it says, here we go. Many of the Jews read the sign. The place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. It was near the city. It's actually 500 feet from the city wall in one direction and 300 feet from the city wall in the other direction. This place is very, very, very near the city at the time of Jesus. And yet, by the time Helen got there, all of that orange area was also part of the city, so it didn't feel like it was outside the city. But it was just outside the city. If you remember John chapter 19, verse 41, it says, here we go. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden, there was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid, because it was the day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. This was a garden. And Golgotha and the tomb are so close to each other, they can be enclosed in the same, albeit large, but the same church complex. And the other thing is that these are first century tombs that are underneath that temple. That is what I think of, right? That's the picture that's in my mind. They're just right. When you walk into them, there's a room, and then you walk a little bit further, and then there's another room. They have the shelves where the boxes go. Everything that you're looking for in a first century tomb is right there. And there's a passage they recently discovered from there up to the tomb of Jesus. These are called, this is called Joseph of Arimathea's tomb and Nicodemus' tomb. So we have first century tombs there. Even if the tomb of Jesus has been covered over in layers of gold and fine linens, this is a very plausible sight. And so, even though the garden tomb on the outside may look really more like what our imagination is, historians say that this is as good of a confirmation as we can have of this being the actual site. The fact that it was venerated way close to when Jesus actually died. The fact that veneration persisted even though there was a pagan temple on it for years and years and years. It's as good as we've got. But the thing that I've been thinking about all week is, why is it that I really want to go there? You know, now I've promised my wife that our kids will be out of high school before I go to Israel and Palestine, right? But why is it that I want to go? There was several years ago that I was at a mission trip in the Dominican Republic. I was on the island of Hispaniola, and there's a church there. It's the very first Christian church in the New World, right? And when I read that in the book, I could not wait to go into that church. Well, it's this idea, people call it different things, but sacred spaces, that there are places that hold something special, something powerful. For me, there's a place up in northern Alabama. There's this camp up there, And it was the place where the summer after my 6th grade year, I felt God calling me into the ministry in an incredibly powerful way. There's this moment where it all came like crashing together when I opened a door. And I love going there because I can go to that place. I can stand right where it happened, right? And there have been people throughout my life that I've taken there and that know my story and I've shared that space with them. But there's something about that space. Every time that I stand in that doorway, every time that I stand in that spot, all kinds of things come. And I bet you have the same kind of spots. You know what's interesting about these sacred places? When archaeologists excavate them, year after year, century after century, millennia after millennia, the same spaces are used for worship. Right? As a matter of fact, the Temple Mount, the tradition is that place, that physical spot on planet Earth. You can go back in time, and there's all of these stories that are connected to that spot, and it's said that the place, there's this stone called the Shetiyah stone, and there's a place right there in the Holy of Holies, and that is the place where God picked up earth and breathed life into Adam. Right? Right there in the Holy of Holies. Which wouldn't surprise me. Because we know that when you excavate these sacred sites, that they were sacred long before the current church was there, long before this current temple was there. This was a sacred spot. And so, I question, why is that? Why is it that these spots are sacred to us? And I think that they're sacred because year after year, people go there, right? They go there expecting something. When I was, that summer after my 6th grade year, it was my first summer camp, and I didn't know what to expect, but I knew that God was going to do something there, and I didn't know what. And we come to church here, right? And we know that something's going to happen. We don't really know what, but we enter those places with a sense of expectation. And so, if you're harshly skeptical, if you're really skeptical, you say, well, that's obvious, that we just manufacture whatever happens there. But I'm a believer, believe in God, and believe that God is present in the world. I actually believe that God is always talking to us. Because the Bible doesn't talk about specific pieces of the world being sacred as much as it talks about the whole earth being sacred. Right? God doesn't just create the Garden of Eden. God creates all of it, including us. And so there's a sense in which the entire earth, all of God's creation, is sacred. And that God is constantly calling out to us. God is constantly talking to us. God is constantly trying to give us those moments of understanding, those moments of insight in all of that sacred space. But the difference is, when I go outside and I open my shed and I pull out my lawnmower to mow this stinking hill that is on my property, I'm not thinking about God. I'm trying to control my tongue. You know what I'm saying? I don't enter that space with a sense of expectation. I think the difference between my lawn and that place in northern Alabama is me. Right? The difference is I'm expecting to hear from God there. I'm not expecting to hear from God when I'm mumbling under my breath on mowing the lawn. And so what I think it means is that God wants us to have a sense of expectation throughout throughout our week. That if we can wake up with a sense of expectation, right? If we can get into the shower with a sense of expectation, if we can get into the car with a sense of expectation, if we can go to work with a sense of expectation that God might be trying to say something to us today, maybe we'll hear it. Maybe God has been trying to communicate with us all along. And there's only sometimes that we open up our ears to hear it. So that is our challenge this week. And that is the challenge of the tombs of Jesus. It's the challenge of sacred spaces is that we come to all of the space, all of the world, with a sense of expectation. So maybe this week, we can hear God, even when we're not at church, even when we're not in that place where we do our Bible study at home. Maybe we can hear God everywhere. Let's pray. God, we thank you that there are special places for us. There are places where you have spoken to us over and over again. For some of us, it's this room. For some of us, it's a camp. For some of us, it's a tree stand. And for some of us, it is some piece of quiet in our house. And thank you that you've given us that. Thank you that throughout the centuries that people have gone to places with a sense of expectation that you're going to speak to them. And so, God, would you help us? Would you help us to live with that sense of expectation in more than one or two or three places? Would you help us throughout this week to live with a sense of expectation that you might be speaking to us the whole time?